Thanks very much, Christoph. And I want to start off, like so many others have, by thanking Christoph and Helmut and everyone at the RCC, staff, students, interns, fellows and visitors. Being here has been a really wonderful and enriching experience. I also want to thank the multi-species reading group who commented on an earlier draft of this paper. In this talk, I'd like to first give a brief overview of a new project I'm working on, and then look in more depth at a particular case study within it. The project centres on a series of studies of environmental histories of different kinds of wetlands in the Murray-Darling Basin in eastern Australia. This river basin contains over 30,000 wetlands, with many recognised today as being of national importance, and 16 being of international importance under the 1971 Ramsar Convention. The hydrology of the rivers and wetlands in this region are central to their ecology. The rivers are characterised by their variable flows in this region and experience periods of intense drying as well as large floods. Because of this, I might get to this. Because of this, many wetlands are ephemeral or increase significantly in area from flood flows. During floods, biodiversity in wetlands along rivers and on floodplains increases as floods trigger breeding cues for many plants and animals. They're part of what has become known as a boom and bust ecology in Australia. The basin is also Australia's agricultural heartland and is often referred to as the nation's food bowl. Today, the management of wetlands in this region is a contentious topic, linked to wider debates over competition between environmental and agricultural water use, as well as Aboriginal people's access to water for a range of reasons, including cultural and economic activities. These debates are also tied to international concerns about the rapid loss of these important sites of biodiversity around the world. These contemporary debates and physical landscapes have been shaped by past approaches to wetlands, including local uses such as timber getting, hunting, fishing and farming, that have both created bonds with particular wetlands and altered them. Broader changes to rivers, for example from the construction of large dams and extensive irrigation networks, particularly across the 20th century, and alterations to aquifers from long-term pumping, have reduced the water available to wetlands. Within these changing water landscapes, new kinds of wetland environments have also emerged with complex histories of their own, like rice paddies and sewage treatment works, which have at times become habitat for animals such as ducks and frogs. This project particularly focused on changes to wetlands from the 19th century and up to contemporary times. This is in order to explore the broader context of the intensification of land and water use in this period. The project focuses on 4 key sites: Toowoomba Swamp in Queensland, Firebow and Tuckerville Swamps and nearby rice fields in the Riverina in New South Wales, Barmah Forest in Victoria and the Coorong in South Australia. I selected these sites to represent a diverse range of wetlands and for the issues they raise. They include wetlands that are recognised as internationally important under the Ramsar Convention, agricultural landscapes and fisheries, sewage treatment works, and wetlands that have been drained for a range of uses, including residential development. Through these studies, I'm interested in exploring what is counted as a wetland for whom and with what consequences, and how has the different interests of those who had a stake in these wetlands come together, and here I'm interested in areas of both conflict and cooperation. The studies also provide an opportunity to examine the ways in which ideas in fauna and flora protection, wetland ecology and conservation at a variety of scales translated in these different places, while at the same time examining how these wetlands have been connected to each other through a range of networks, including the movement of people and birds, as well as ideas and expertise. Science-based studies of wetlands in this basin predominate. We know less about other viewpoints, such as those of custodians of local knowledge, Aboriginal people, farmers and town dwellers, or how scientific expertise developed within a specific cultural context. A focus of this project is on changing scientific approaches to wetlands and the cultural context in which specific approaches, for example wetland ecology, were developed and operated, as well as giving voice to other kinds of understandings. The term wetland is important in this history, particularly in considering international wetland conservation efforts from the mid-20th century. In some ways, what is meant by wetlands today can be seen as an invention of this period. The word wetland and its plural wetlands rose to global prominence during this time, but particularly from the 1970s. Tracing the cultural histories of wetlands, Sylvia Haslam has claimed that wetland was an American term that at some point crossed the Atlantic and soon came into common usage in England. The particularities of this history is somewhat unclear. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary claims that the first known use was in 1669. It is a compound of the words wet and land, which have been used together for a very long time and more widely in English as landscape descriptors. Wetlands at its broadest has often been defined as exactly that, land that is wet, and has included a wide spectrum of water types and depths, soils, areas, and duration of flooding. The word's vague and broad meaning seems to at least somewhat explain its rise to global prominence, as it has acted as a global catch-all for local descriptors like moor, fen, both English, slough, Canada and the USA, and billabong, which is an Australian word that invented a river that no longer connects to the main channel, but which filled with water during floods. Its use rose alongside conservation efforts in the 1960s and 70s, which were characterised by a new focus on habitat protection and a strong relationship with ecology, which also gained increasing traction in this period among biologists as well as conservationists. Wetlands became an important focus for these groups in places like the USA, Europe and Australia. In broad terms, they were increasingly concerned by the accumulating effects of intensifying land and water use practices on wildlife, particularly the reduction in area and water quality of these places. Ornithologists and hunters were especially vocal lobby groups in wetland protection that both aimed to protect waterfowl. In this period, wetlands came to describe a type of habitat that needed to be conserved. This is best epitomised in the 1971 Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, which initially placed special emphasis on protecting wetlands as waterfowl habitat, and Australia was actually one of its first signatories. As far as I know, this remains the only international convention on conserving a type of habitat. And these graphs just give an indication of the history of the use of the word. So you can see here that wetlands appears in the Oxford English Dictionary in 1955 as a compound, and you can also see its rise within publications that are documented in the Scopus database. But how is all this an invention? The global rise of the word wetland and its use as a description of a kind of habitat, and particularly its presence as a key word in an international convention that aimed to protect these places, remade the world in a particular way. It grouped places together in a new way and held a politics of conservation that has influenced how people, animals and plants interacted in them. Wetlands management has become contentious in some places, especially where it is linked to the exclusion of particular people, animals and plants from protected areas. While the scale and terminology of these international efforts were in many ways new, they also had a history. These international efforts brought together many existing local activities and concerns and ignored others, and these often had much longer histories. In Australia, for instance, there have been earlier attempts to set aside these kind of places for a range of reasons, from economic to recreational to animal and plant protection amid concerns over local extinction, that tried to stipulate both human and non-human uses. For the remainder of this paper, I'll focus on one of these earlier efforts. This history concentrates on the mass killing of young pelicans on islands in the Coorong Lagoon in South Australia in 1911, and the subsequent leasing of the islands by a group of ornithologists who sought to protect the pelicans and other birds that nested there. This event reveals a longer history of contention over these places, and in this case competing views over killing, protection and private property by fishermen, ornithologists and local Aboriginal people. It illuminates how places and their human and non-human inhabitants have shaped and been shaped by laws and regulatory structures. While a range of individuals and groups were involved, my discussion here primarily centres on two groups: the pelicans that nested on the islands and the ornithologists that sought to protect them. I first came across this event through an archive held in the State Records of South Australia that documented the leasing of the islands to the ornithologists. The archive reveals the complex roles of both the law and the ornithologists, as the ornithologists sought to manoeuvre through a legalised landscape and find ways around legislation that did not offer the kinds of protection they wanted for birds, with a range of mixed outcomes for all those involved. In this presentation, I draw on this archive as well as other sources such as newspapers and ornithological publications, critically placing them in the broader colonial power structures and discourses in which they were generated. and using them to examine both the ornithologist's complex position over pelican protection and as a lens onto wider issues and other sets of values. My approach engages with scholarship in environmental history that has sought to examine the changing legal and regulatory dimensions of animal protection. For example, Mark Fiot's analysis of international treaties, which in the 20th century initially sought to regulate the killing of migratory animals rather than protect habitat. It also resonates with emerging interdisciplinary scholarship in legal geography, which broadly seeks to examine the reciprocal construction of law and spatiality. Today, the Coorong is an iconic wetland in Australia, known for its bird life. It is a long, relatively thin and shallow saline lagoon located southeast of Adelaide. In the north, it lies adjacent to two lakes, Lake Alexandrina and Lake Albert, and the mouth of the Murray River. From there, it stretches approximately 100 kilometres south. Historically, this area has attracted many different kinds of birds, with over 200 species recorded in the region, as well as other animals and plants. In 1966, part of the region was declared a national park, and in 1975, the area was listed as a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention, and that's the same year that the convention came into force. The Australian pelican is just one of the birds that visits the Coorong. It is, though, a visually prominent one, as these birds can number in the thousands. They have a distinctive look with a large pink bill and black white plumage and a beak. In fact, Australian pelicans are one of the heaviest flying birds in the world, with adult males on average weighing 8 kilograms. It is perhaps no surprising that the species name, Pelecanus conspiculatus, means conspicuous. Like many Australian water birds, they are nomadic rather than migratory and are able to respond to sometimes drastic changes in water and fish availability. Pelicans nest colonially and often use islands for rookery sites, which offer some protection to eggs and young birds from predators. For pelicans, one of the reasons the Coorong is significant is because of its islands. They have nested on the Pelican Islands in the lagoon, which is a group of 6 small islands, almost every year since records began to be kept in the colonial period. By the early 20th century, ornithologists regarded the islands as one of only 2 main nesting places for pelicans in the state. Prior to British colonisation, the Ngarrindjeri Indigenous people lived in the region for approximately 8,000 years. Aboriginal laws stem from sets of relationship with particular country, for example, between people, plants, animals, land and water, and areas have primarily been the territory of certain groups. The Coorong was the territory of the Tananelka, one group was in the Ngarrindjeri. During the period of initial British colonisation, which began in earnest in South Australia in the 1930s, Ngarrindjeri numbers significantly decreased, due mostly to introduced diseases such as smallpox, as well as frontier conflict with colonists. The British government had declared South Australia to be unoccupied prior to official colonisation, and in the late 19th and early 20th century, many Ngarrindjeri were moved onto land set aside by the government for Aboriginal people and onto pastoral stations and missions. A small fishing industry started in the Coorong and Lower Lakes region in the 1840s, expanding rapidly after 1885, when steam rail connected the local town of Goolwa to Adelaide markets. Local fishermen have long seen pelicans as pests, and reports of young pelicans being killed and eggs smashed on the islands of the Coorong go back to at least the 1870s. It is unclear how often these raids on the rookeries happen, but there is some evidence that they may have happened almost every year. In many ways then, the 1911 slaughter was not an unusual event. However, the strength of the debates it mobilised, particularly regarding bird protection, the archival and newspaper records it generated and its fallout, clearly indicated that something set it apart. In many ways, this something may be the particular historical moment, locally and more widely, in which the slaughter took place, including past raids and wider government efforts to limit damage from pests to both fisheries and agriculture, as well as a growing protection ethos among a range of individuals and groups. In 1911, approximately 2,000 pelicans were slaughtered on the Pelican Islands, most, if not all, of which were young birds. A group of local men had in fact waited for a large number of eggs to hatch in order to kill more birds. This was so that they could collect the maximum payout from a 1 penny bounty that had recently been put on the head of each pelican by the Fisheries Department, State Department, for which they needed to present the heads. Already seen as a problem by many fishermen, the birds had been added to an official list of pests in state fisheries legislation in 1909. Pelicans thus joined other animals that had been included as pests in the original Fisheries Act of 1904, including cormorants, turtles and tortoises. All of these animals were blamed by fishermen for eating and thereby reducing the hauls of marketable fish, and could have a bounty declared on them by the Fisheries Minister. Pelicans were particularly conspicuous competitors as they took fish from nets, often while fishermen brought the catch to the surface. However, at the same time pelicans were officially listed as pests, they were also protected for part of the year in the state, along with many other birds under the Bird Protection Act 1900. This legislation gets a little tricky, so I've tried to clarify it with a table. This Act had 3 schedules, that is the Bird Protection Act. The small group of birds that were listed in the first schedule were protected throughout the state all year. The second schedule included the majority birds, which were protected at particular times of year and included pelicans. And the third schedule listed birds that were not protected at all. Until recently, pelicans on the Pelican Islands and the Coorong had in fact been protected all year round. In 1908, the Governor had declared part of the region which encompassed the islands a bird protection district under the same Act for a period of 5 years. This protected birds in the area that were listed in the first and second schedules of the Act for the whole year, but not those in the third. The protected status of pelicans on the islands and throughout the state changed again in 1910. When the state government removed pelicans from the second schedule and placed them in the third. This meant that there was now no closed season on killing them and that they were no longer protected in the protection district. Presumably pelicans were moved to this schedule to tally with their listing as a pest to fisheries in 1909. Then the Minister declared a bonus of a penny per head on pelicans. While there were a number of legal factors and interests at play, the bounty was regarded by many as the direct motivation for the slaughter. Money may have been the ultimate goal of those that did the killing. They did it in such a way as to claim the bounty. That is, they waited for the birds to hatch in order to collect their heads, as they needed to present these to the authorised officials. Given the view of many fishermen that pelicans were a pest and that they had been past rates, those who did the killing may have also seen this as a community service of sorts to the local fishing industry. The bounty encouraged people to kill pelicans, reinforcing it as a community-minded action. However, as news of the slaughter spread, many people were outraged at young birds being massacred and questioned whether pelicans were a pest at all. In February 1911, news began to reach Adelaide of the slaughter. A local resident of the Coorong area, F.G. Ayres, wrote to the Daily Herald, a metropolitan newspaper published in Adelaide, describing the slaughter and to alert the bird-loving public of South Australia to the law which permits the destruction of pelicans. He blamed the government and not the men for such scandalous destruction of one of the most majestic birds in Australia, and argued that pelicans were being unnecessarily persecuted, as other birds like herons and egrets that also ate fish were protected. Some of the bird-loving public Ayres referred to were the members of the South Australian Ornithological Association. The members were strong advocates of bird protection and had been involved in lobbying for a range of bird protection districts to be established in the state. One of the members, Samuel White, which is pictured here in the top right, but he's the left-hand person, Samuel White expressed his views to newspapers soon after the publication of Ayres' letter, stating that it is one of the most dastardly acts I have ever heard of. He argued that more of these sorts of raids, so brutally perpetrated, would lead to the extermination of this remarkable bird. White thought that pelicans were being unfairly vilified and argued that the ornithologists can prove that pelicans do not consume the enormous quantities of fish that they are alleged to do. Indeed, other biologists and members of the association similarly argued that pelicans did not eat enough fish to be pests, or that they ate fish like bony herring that commercial fishermen did not want. White asserted that it was not just pelicans who were targeted unfairly, but also cormorants, and that instead of increasing fish hauls where cormorants have been destroyed, fish have diminished in number. He also drew parallels with the USA, where pelican numbers had plummeted after similarly being targeted as competitors for fish. However, White stated about 3 or 4 years ago that the authorities awoke to the fact that these birds were not injurious to the fishermen's trade, and the authorities set to work to re-establish the birds by proclaiming an island where pelicans could still be found as a bird sanctuary. Ornithologists and others saw the pelican massacre as possibly contributing to growing instances of local and species extinction of birds in Australia and around the world. In the North Atlantic, great auks had become extinct in the 1840s, and pelicans as well as other birds could no longer be found in some areas of Australia, they argued due to human activities. The story of the raid on the rookeries, and particularly White's interview, was picked up by metropolitan newspapers across Australia, Eastern Australia, and in some regional presses. One reporter wrote, "The massacre had amounted to thousands, and this would soon exterminate the quaint bird, of which Australia had only the one species." Indeed, many reporters commented on Australian pelicans as quaint, noble and remarkable birds that were endemic to the continent and so in need of protection. The massacre of young birds seemed insupportable to many, particularly when coupled with White's argument that pelicans in fact were not eating the quantities of fish that the fishing industry claimed. One reporter called the massacre of pelicans illogic and another both foolish and cruel. While no one defended the killing of young birds, local fishermen voiced their views that pelicans reduced their hauls and eating the fish they wanted to market. A former fisherman from the nearby town of Ningi, W. Tregellis, wrote that, "I've frequently been 4 or 5 dozen brims short due to pelicans. I've put out a mullet net at night and in the morning have seen about 20 or more pelicans along the net, quietly saving me the trouble of taking the fish out. But they would go a little further than that and cause me to buy more nets because of the damage they caused when they pulled the fish out." While many saw the pelican as a national icon, for Tregellis, pelicans were one of the most useless and ugly birds we have. Fishermen, ornithologists and others disputed knowledge about pelican behaviour, specifically whether or not they ate large quantities of marketable fish. These conflicting knowledges may reflect the different values between these groups, which could fundamentally frame how they define the problem. For example, these groups may have held different views about what were acceptable losses. What ornithologists regarded as minor losses, fishermen may have seen as major or unacceptable, with the added expense or inconvenience of damaged nets. Here I have a section that placed these events in a longer and wider historical context, and I don't have time to go into this in depth here, so I'll try and do it quite briefly. The pelican slaughter and its fallouts, which I'll discuss shortly, were shaped by contested ideas and values at a range of scales, including international. Environmental historian Thomas Dunlap noted animal bounties in the Anglo-European settlements in the USA, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Everywhere the settlers had the same goals and used the same technologies, but the land and the animals were different. These differences and similarities were important in shaping local responses. Many other laws concerning animals also resonated between these places, and at times others, like India and Africa, which shared a range of cultural and economic links through the British Empire, and although it had local particularities, as each place did. In Australia, early legislation in the mid-19th century for the protection of animals was part of the wider project of government and private efforts towards acclimatisation and indeed colonisation, which was undertaken in many other places. These laws often sought to establish useful or valuable European game species like pheasants and rabbits, as well as protecting Australian native game from overhunting, for example native ducks, which took on the role of similar game species as those in Europe. In the late 19th century and early 20th century this changed, as most Australian states passed legislation that offered some protection to native animals by default, and unprotected animals needed to be listed. South Australia did this in 1874, which was relatively early in Australia. This shift reflected people's concerns that many kinds of native birds were being hunted for a range of reasons, not just gentlemanly sport, and were in danger of being exterminated altogether. Colonists were killing native birds, for example, as pests for the millinery trade, and pelicans were actually hunted for their plumage and for market, and others were often being killed accidentally due to these activities. In addition, birds were routinely captured to trade as exotic pets to overseas customers and killed as trophies. The protection laws mainly aimed to regulate hunting through closed seasons over the period that was thought to be the birds' breeding seasons. Yet the laws that aimed to protect birds and other animals were often ignored, and many people killed them all year round. While these acts marked a shift in bird protection, they were also seen by some as a continuation of British game laws. In Britain, game acts were passed from the late 18th century, which entrenched divisions and heightened tensions between socio-economic classes by implementing laws that gave the landholder the right to protect animals against poaching or trespass. Effectively, this meant that those who owned land could kill game on their land all year round, and those who were not landowners could not. Those who caught or killed game on other people's land could be heavily fined and, if caught, at night imprisoned. In Australia, many people wanted to prevent similar laws from being replicated. Yet in South Australia, these protection laws were seen by some to similarly favour landowners, as they could do as they liked on their own land while others were excluded, and killing on Crown land was heavily regulated. Aboriginal people were exempt from these laws if they were hunting or collecting eggs on Crown land, but not on private land, unless they first gained the permission of the owner. Animals and birds are important in Aboriginal kinship and livelihoods. For instance, in the Coorong region, pelicans were important to the Ngarrindjeri people. Their eggs were collected for food, the birds were eaten, and the fat was used for strengthening plant fibres and the feathers for hunting equipment. While the exemption of Aboriginal people from the Act, which meant they could hunt all year round, in the view of the British colonial government, might be seen as a recognition of the importance of hunting and egg collecting in sustaining Aboriginal communities, it is better understood within contested colonial legal views, which, as noted by R.N. Watson, an Indigenous scholar from the Coorong region, centred on whether Aboriginal people could be tried under colonial laws. The bird protection laws also reinforced the ongoing dispossession of Aboriginal people since colonisation by excluding them from privatised lands. Alongside these protected acts were those that aimed to destroy animals and birds that were seen to be pests. In Australia, by the 1880s, there was an extensive system of bounties in place for particular native and introduced animals and birds, supported by legislation. Many of these, including those in South Australia, included provision for scalp money on birds and animals that were declared pests to crop and livestock farmers. In South Australia, it was only with the Fisheries Act of 1904 that animals that were regarded as pests by fishermen were officially listed as such. Prior legislation had really concentrated on land-based agriculture. This bounty system was part of what many, as historian Penny Olsen wrote, have been described as the fauna wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in which many animals and birds were killed as they were seen to compete for resources or were blamed for stock crop and fish losses. The killing undertaken in this period was extensive and often became fixated on eliminating particular groups of animals in a given area. Debbie Bird-Rose, in her work on past and more recent dingo baiting in Australia, has used the phrase "rule to destruction" to describe this kind of systematic killing of all of a particular kind of animal. A single pest animal or bird was seen as too many by some farmers and fishermen, but not all, and any losses as too much. It was within this context, from the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, that arguments for the protection of birds as valuable to farming and fishing, in addition to hunting interests, gained increasing traction among biologists and advocacy groups. Internationally, movements to protect birds were also growing. In Britain, the USA, New Zealand and Canada, advocacy groups were forming to protest the killing of birds, particularly the use of bird skins and feathers in women's fashion, a trend for which millions of birds from around the world were being killed each year. With these motivations, in many places across this period, government departments and advocates argued for the protection of birds based on their utility in agriculture and fisheries, as they ate other pests, or, they argue, maintained a balance in nature. Indeed, protecting useful species were one of the main goals of the South Australian Ornithological Association. Support for humanitarian protection of birds and animals also grew through the first decades of the 20th century, and these sentiments were evident, for instance, in the widespread condemnation of the slaughter of young pelicans in 1911. Soon after the slaughter, the ornithologists sought security for the rookeries against similar future events from the Crown Lands Commissioner. Ultimately, the Commissioner, who also had a personal interest in bird protection, decided to lease a number of the islands, including the Pelican Islands, to the Ornithological Association to create a place where the birds were protected absolutely, even those in the third schedule of unprotected birds. With the lease, the islands came under the laws of private property. A condition of the lease was, in fact, that the ornithologists prevent people from visiting the islands, and they soon erected signs which notified people to keep off. Aboriginal people's collection of eggs of both black swans and pelicans became entangled in these responses to the pelican slaughter. One of the intentions of leasing the islands appears to have been to stop Aboriginal people from gathering bird eggs. One of the editors of EMU, which was the journal of the National Royal Australian Ornithological Union, wrote a short statement in one of the volumes drawing attention to this. He wrote, "Samuel White, who was the ornithologist I discussed earlier, has been making strenuous efforts to secure legislation for the protection of pelicans and to prevent the Aborigines from robbing the nests of black swans and pelicans. The island rookeries will, now that they have been leased, be less liable to receive visits from bird killers and egg robbers." It was within the context of concerns about the effects of bounties and raids on these rookeries by fishermen, as well as within longer histories of killing fauna since colonisation, that Aboriginal people's collection of eggs was seen by ornithologists and others as damaging to pelicans and swans. While the ornithologists saw the leasing of the islands as an immediate measure to prevent Aboriginal people from gathering eggs on the islands, changing the legislation to prevent these practices more widely so that Aboriginal people were subject to bird protection laws seems to have been a broader goal of at least some of the ornithologists. Another ornithologist wrote in a report to the Crown Lands Commissioner that the natives robbed the nest disgracefully, taking both fresh and well-incubated eggs. The latter are thrown out. I have the records from authentic sources that the natives go in small parties to the best breeding places and take hauls of 200, 400 and 500 eggs for swans. This is repeated as long as the laying lasts. The Bird Protection Act should be applied to blacks and whites from the line south of Adelaide and Manning. He wrote that these parts are now fairly well civilised and suggested that rations be given by the government to local Aboriginal people as compensation. These statements resonated with the complementary discourses of colonisation, race and assimilation that gained increasing traction in Australia in the 19th century and endured into the 20th century. Echoing these discourses, the State Animals Protection Act 1912 stated that only full-blooded Aboriginal people were exempt from bird protection legislation. While the next Protection Act in 1919 did not include this qualification, it included the paternalistic provision that if any of the privileges are being abused, the governor could suspend them. The National Parks and Wildlife Act 1972 did not include any provision for Aboriginal hunting or collecting, and cultural geographer Philip Clark noted that after this act, swan egging practices of the local Aboriginal people were by stealth in the region. Many state acts of the 1970s did not include exemptions for Aboriginal people and therefore prevented activities such as hunting, burning and harvesting plant material within protected areas. These acts helped fulfil Australia's obligations under the Ramsar Convention in places like the Coorong. In recent decades, in Coorong National Park, Aboriginal rangers have, however, facilitated incorporation of some of these activities into park management. Over the last 40 years, various avenues have also been developed at state and national levels through which to include Indigenous people in protected areas management, a process that has been significantly influenced by the Aboriginal lands rights movement. A few months following the slaughter, pelicans have returned to at least some of the islands. Current understandings of pelican biology tells us that pelican chicks have a high mortality rate even without people killing large numbers of them, and there had been past raids. Perhaps then the slaughter of 1911 was not as significant an event to the pelicans as it was to the ornithologists. However, in 1963, an ornithologist reported that across the previous 60 years there had been a marked decline in the number of pelicans in the region. He attributed this partly to the raids on the rookeries, which had continued despite the leasing of the islands, but also to a range of changes in the lagoon and the region more generally within this short period. These included the draining of swamplands for agriculture both locally and along the length of the Murray River, the canalisation of this river for shipping and irrigation, the construction of barrages blocking the Murray River mouth, and the introduction and spread of new species of fish throughout the Murray River system. Some of these changes helped to increase the salinity and alter the depth of the lagoon, as well as changing other aspects of the pelican's habitat and food resources. After a widely publicised raid on the rookeries in 1962, the state government regained management of the islands, declaring them prohibited areas and placing them under the care of the Fisheries and Game Department, which later became part of the National Park. Contemporary problems pose new questions, particularly those raised by anthropogenic climate change. But the complex, contested sets of values and what is at stake in these outcomes today resonate with those of the pelican slaughter of 1911. Indeed, in some ways they cannot be fully understood without these histories, which show the longer processes behind later efforts for wetlands conservation. We continue to live in contested landscapes and with the legacies of these past disputes. The slaughter and the leasing of the islands reveal some of the intersecting ideas about killing, private property and protection that were at times at odds and sometimes in agreement, and which shaped both lives and livelihoods on the Coorong. Thank you.